everybody, this is Ms. Canair. Today we are going to cover factor by grouping. So this is a special type of factoring and it really only works with one specific case. So here we go. So factor by grouping may only be used when you have 4 terms. Only 4, that's the only time that we can use factor by grouping. So here are the 5 steps to factor by grouping. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to split the polynomial in 2. That's really important. You're going to split it in 2 so that each part has 2 terms. Then we're going to find the greatest common factor of the first 2, find the greatest common factor of the second 2, and we're going to make sure that the parentheses are exactly the same on both sides after we've split it. And then we're going to factor out the common binomial and we will have completely completed factor by grouping. So pause right here if you need a second to copy this down. So again, I wanted to show you guys an example of what this looks like before we dive in and we start an example ourselves. So if you notice, the first thing we did is we took the polynomial and we split it in 2 with this red line right here. So then from there we looked at the first 2 terms. So I've got 4x to the third plus 16x squared. That's the first 2 terms. And then the second 2 terms, I've got this negative 3x and this minus 12. So looking at the first 2 terms that I underlined in green, we pull out the greatest common factor, and I hope you guys were able to see that 4x squared is the greatest common factor. So after we factor that out, we just write what we have left. And after we factored out a 4x squared, we've got this x plus 4 squared. Or just x plus 4. Then we jump to the next set of terms to factor, and we've got this negative 3x minus 12. So again, factor out the greatest common factor. Negative 3 is our greatest common factor, and after that, all we have left is this x plus 4. So now we're finally in that last step of factoring, where we look for the common binomial. And I hope you guys see that x plus 4 is the same in both of them. That means that we've done factor by grouping right. So I'm just going to copy down one set of that. That is the common binomial in this polynomial after we factored it. And then in the second set of parentheses over here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy down what I have left. And all that I have left is this 4x squared and this minus 3. And we have officially completed factor by grouping. I know it's kind of weird and it looks like a lot, but I hope after a couple examples this will be a lot easier for you. Again, I want you guys to take note that if there is not a greatest common factor for all the terms, you immediately should go ahead and you should start to factor by grouping. The other thing that you could add in here is that to make sure that you've also combined any like terms. Because remember, you can only use factor by grouping if you have 4 terms. So if you are able to combine like terms and to find out that you don't have 4 terms anymore, then you don't actually have to use factor by grouping. Alright, so let's try an example ourselves. So remember, the first step is to always split it in 2. Split it into 2 equal parts. So I'm going to draw a red line down the middle. So then we look at the first 2 terms, and I have 4x to the third plus 2x to the third. And I apologize, that should probably be a 2x squared. So on your paper, please change that to a 2x squared. So let's look and figure out what's the greatest common factor between these 2 terms. And I hope that you're able to see that 2x squared is the greatest common factor between those 2 terms. So if I factor that out, what I'll have left is 2x plus 1, right? To get from 2x squared back to 2x squared, I would just have to multiply by a 1. All right, so that part's done. So we want the second set of parentheses to be the same. Keep that in mind when we're doing this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this sign down, and let's look at what's the common factor between these 2 terms. So if you look at negative 2 and negative 1, there really is no other common factor besides a 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to factor out a 1. And then we've got to write what we have left. So there's a couple tricks to do this. So we know that this parenthesis has to match this one, and if I've already figured out the first one, then I know that has to match. So that has to be the second parentheses. So we can double check quick. So negative 1 times 2x will get me my 2x, negative 2x. And negative 1 times positive 1 will give me my negative 1. So we've done it correctly. So the last step is I see that this is the common binomial in this factor by grouping problem. So I'm going to copy that down here, 2x plus 1. The last step is to write what we have left. And I see that we have left this 2x squared and this minus 1. So I'm going to write 2x squared minus 1. And we have officially completed this problem by factor by grouping. If you need to pause for a second and copy anything down or take any mental notes, please feel free to take any notes that you feel are important for you to remember how to do this method. So again, by like anything in math, just practicing is going to get us so much better at this. So let's practice another one. So factor by grouping. Remember the first thing you do, split it down the middle. Then what we're going to do is we're going to look for the common factor in the first two terms. And after looking at it for a second, I hope that you guys are able to see that 2 and 3 share no common factors except for a 1. And remember, we don't normally write ones we're factoring because we don't need more numbers and more things thrown at us. So the only thing that's common is this x squared. So if I factor out an x squared, I've got 2x minus 3 left. All right, so always bring down the sign after the parentheses. So I'm going to bring down my minus sign. So let's take a look at what do we have. So again, 2 and a 3. The only common factor is a 1. So I'm going to factor out a 1. So after that, remember, we know that the parentheses have to match. So if this is 2x minus 3, I know the second one has to be 2x minus 3. All right, we're almost done. So again, we've made these parentheses match. That's exactly what the point of factor by grouping is. So I'm going to factor out one of those. So I will have 2x minus 3. So remember, what we write first is what we have left. And we have this x squared and this minus 1. So I'm going to write x squared minus 1. We are almost done, and at this point right now, I would say that this answer is totally okay. Except the last thing you should check to see if either one of these are more or can be factored more. And any time that we see something like this, that usually tells us that we do not have to factor anymore, that we're just about done at that point. The only thing to take a look at is this other one, this x squared minus 1. That can actually be factored more. And that's actually called the difference of squares, which if you have not learned already, you will be learning very, very soon. So let's just take a look at this really quick. So x squared minus 1. I could rewrite this as x squared plus 0x minus 1. So now we treat this like a regular factoring problem. So think about your factors of 1 that would add to 0. So take a second to think about it. Our only factors of 1 are 1 and 1. And if I want 0, that tells me that 1 has to be positive, 1 has to be negative. Because 1 minus 1 will give us our 0. So instead of this x squared minus 1 up here, I'm actually going to write these two parentheses. So this is going to be x plus 1 and x minus 1. And then we've also had this other parenthesis, 2x minus 3. That is fully factored. So again, you have to be very careful, and you want to take a look and see, can I actually factor anything anymore? And if you can, you totally should, because this is our final answer right there. Again, pause it for a second if you need to copy anything down. All right. Last example. Again, factor by grouping. 4 terms that we know we can do it. Remember, the other thing I said to check for is to see if you have any like variables. So remember, like variables have to have the same variable and the same exponent in order to be added together. In this case, we don't, so we go ahead with factor by grouping. So split it in 2. So looking at the first 2 terms, let's figure out what our greatest common factor is. And after looking at it for a second, I hope that you're able to figure out that 3 is the greatest common factor between 6 and 21. In addition, they both have 2 x's, so I can factor out an x squared. So, if that's what I factor out, take a look at what do you have left. So, I would have 2x minus 7 left. All right, first half is done. Remember, bring down the sign that's right after the parenthesis. So let's take a look at 8x and negative 28. Common factors. What's the greatest common factor between those? Take a second, it should be a 4. We can't pull an x out because this negative 28 doesn't have an x. So, factoring out 4, that means that I would have 2x minus 7 left. So, did we do factor by grouping correctly? Remember, we want both parentheses to match. And if you look at that, both parentheses match, 2x minus 7. So we're going to factor out one of those parentheses, because that's the common binomial. So I'm going to write 2x minus 7. Sorry, I have no idea why I decided to write that in blue. And then we're going to write whatever we have left. And we've got this 3x squared and this plus 4. 3x squared plus 4. Again, remember the last thing would be to look and see if we can factor this 3x squared plus 4. And I'll tell you right now that you can't, and we will learn very, very shortly as to why that is not factorable anymore. But you are done. This is the answer to the problem. Pause for a second if you need to copy anything down. And let's do one more example. So, I would recommend pausing it right here and trying this problem by yourself before I walk you through it. So pause the video right now. Alright, let's walk through this one quick. So, factor by grouping, split it evenly in two. So looking at the first two terms, find the greatest common factor. So, 35 and 42, I hope that after a second you were able to see that 7 is the greatest common factor between those two. In addition, they both have two x's, so I can pull out x squared. After I do that, I've got 5x minus 6 left. Alright, rule of thumb is going to bring down the sign that follows that parenthesis right there. And let's take a look at what these have in common. So 30 and 36. Let's see, what do they both have in common? Hopefully you were able to figure out that it is a 6. So if you factor out a 6, what do we have left? Remember, you're kind of actually factoring out a negative 6, so just be really careful with your signs. So negative 6 is going to have to be a 5x, and be careful because this one's tricky. 36 and negative 6. That's going to have to be a negative 6 because negative 6 times negative 6 will give me my positive 36. Alright, cool. Let's see. Do we do factor by grouping? Do we do it correctly? Our parentheses match, so yes, we definitely did. So remember, I'm going to factor out one of those binomials. So I've got 5x minus 6. And then you're just going to write what you have left. And what I have left, 7x squared minus 6. Again, relatively quickly here, if you have not already, you will learn the difference of squares. And that would kind of look something like this first set of parentheses right here. And we'll talk about what that means. But I will tell you right now that that one does not factor very nicely, so we are going to leave it just like that. Alright, that is the end of the factor by grouping video. Thank you for watching, and now please do your homework assignment. Thanks, guys.